Um, I know your father is Israeli and you're the grandson of Holocaust survivors. And I'm just curious how your father's life experiences, your grandparents' life experiences have helped shape the person you've become today.
I think the most formative experience of my youth was the annual gatherings that we had each year for Seder. And every Seder that we had celebrated the Exodus, but in a way that was deeply personal to our family because for my great grandfather, my great grandmother, my grandmother, my great aunt, who were all survivors who lived in hiding in what is today Ukraine under the floorboards of a dacha outside a town called Zvochev. The United States had been our promised land. The Exodus had happened in the lifetimes of those around the table, and the end of the Seder ended with two songs. One was God Bless America and the other is Hatikva. We very much knew where our promised lands were. And for my father, of course, his family had also, his mother would left on one of the last boats that would leave, if not the last boat in family lore, it's the last boat that would leave Europe during the war. I'm not sure. She was a stowaway and imprisoned by the British in Palestine. His dad fought in the British Army and then fought the British as a member of the Palmach and the Haganah under Moshe Dayan in 1948. He was part of the War of Independence and then stayed in the Army until the mid 50s. He was the commander of the artillery school. So those were the formative experiences of my youth, and I grew up knowing what this country had given to our family, the protection that it afforded us as Jews, and grew up wanting to pay that back. And that has set me on a lifetime of service, whether that was going to West Point and serving in Iraq and Afghanistan, whether that's my continued service in the Virginia House of Delegates, where I've been leading the fight to combat hate crimes most recently with a new bill that we just proposed, and whether it's looking to serve on a new level as a candidate for U.S. Congress.
Um, Piggybacking on something you just said about your military service. So, in addition to the tours in Afghanistan and Iraq and Korea that you served, uh, you're also still a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army Reserve. And I'm curious, what does it mean to you to have served your country and continue to serve your country through this way, through your service in the military?
It's interesting. My Jewishness is deeply tied to service. I often think of Tikkun Olam, and I think of it oftentimes in terms of America's role in the world too, as a Jew who serves in a couple of the instruments of American power. I believe deeply in the force of our country for good and prosperity and peace in the world. I teach as a reservist international relations at West Point. And when you think about the post-war international order, which played a very major role, of course, in our lives, it was after my great grandfather with his family, my grandmother escaped from Eastern Europe, where the Soviets had come in and then declared them enemies of the state again for being Jews. It wasn't enough that the Nazis persecuted them. They made their way to Berlin, and a Captain Elias, my grandfather, my great grandfather was serving as a translator for Highest, convinced him to come to the United States. And I think about that small role, like for our small family story, as part of a larger world story of what America's promise is, not just for Americans, but for all people when we assume the mantle of leadership in the world. And I see military service as part of ensuring that mantle of leadership continues well into the 21st century.
So your military service is obviously admirable, and it's a step that not everybody would be willing to take, and a sacrifice they'd be willing to make. However, you went a step further, and you sought to continue your life's calling in public service as an elected official. And I'm curious, what led you to pursue elected office, and how did that all come about?
One of the things I did uniquely at 17, my parents actually had to, you talk about a poor Jewish mother. My mom had to sign a release to let me go to West Point because I was still 17 when basic training started.
I'm sure she loved
Uh,
that. Yeah,
yeah, no, she's a wonderful, she's a mensch,
yeah.
you know, you raise your right hand, you swore an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And in the wake of Trump's election, I felt that Constitution, our democracy, were under threat. And they were under threat because we had too few politicians willing to stand up and fight for our democracy in the, just as I had served to protect our country overseas, I felt I needed to serve and protect it here at home. And that launched my career in public service. And I'm proud to have been able to stand up for democracy by passing legislation to protect voter rights. I'm proud to have led the charge in a number of major pieces of gun legislation so that MAGA extremists can't scare us out of our streets and threaten us in our schools and our homes. And I have felt that idea of service that I experienced as an active duty military officer, continue to do a reserve, is something that I've been able to continue in a different way through my service in the General Assembly in Virginia, and something I hope to do in U.S. Congress when elected there.
Okay. You mentioned a few minutes ago that you just introduced legislation to combat anti-Semitism. My understanding is it has to do with an amendment to the Virginia hate crime law and strengthening that to include acts of anti-Semitism and religious intolerance. Um, Needless to say, it's both timely and important amid rising anti-Semitism, both in the United States and abroad, particularly since October 7th. Could you talk about just a little bit about what led you to introduce that particular piece of legislation?
Like many Jews, I have witnessed with alarm the rise of anti-Semitism, uh, first in the wake of the Trump presidency, where we had jackbooted Nazis marching through Charlottesville saying that we will not be replaced, and continuing through today, where we see the hard anti-Semitism on the right and occasionally the soft anti-Semitism of the far left, and know that we need to take meaningful, active measures to combat anti-Semitism, and that rhetoric alone will not do the trick. And so I was proud to sponsor this hate crimes legislation that ensures that if you attack somebody because they are a Jew, if you desecrate their home or their synagogue because they are a Jew, that you are committing a crime. If you deny them accommodation because they are a Jew, you are at odds with our law. And that ought to be the law of our land. It ought not need to be the law, but it is very clear in these times that it must be.
So yeah, so in 2021, you were the subject of a campaign mailer that many people considered to be anti-Semitic. As a Jewish elected official, how have you dealt with anti-Semitism over the years in a general sense?
Yeah, so as we talked about earlier, I'm very proud to be standing up for hate crimes legislation. I also am very proud to stand up against anti-Semitism by defeating those who take on tactics like that. And the response to the use of an anti-Semitic mailer in a swing district was to deliver a resounding victory in a district that, prior to me unseating a Republican incumbent 2 years prior, had never been held by a Democrat. And we won again in spite of that hate. And more broadly, I think that when you stand up and fight for democracy, fight to protect our liberal democratic institutions, you also fight anti-Semitism by making sure that every single American, including American Jewry, has a seat at the table and the ability to stand up for our community, stand together, have our voices heard, and make sure that our policy reflects the America that we want to see here at home as well as abroad.